So this is Cameron George from TruKava, which is basically nature's most powerful stress and anxiety reliever, and pseudo subtle entheogenic compound. It's a great sort of adjunct to almost any fat burning and anxiety and stress relieving regimen. And you can find out more about it on Joel Evans' podcast. It's a great sort of one stop shop for just ways to improve your health and your overall life.
Hey, what's up? Joel Evan here, host of the Hack Life podcast and weight loss coach for busy men. I'm excited to tell you I just dropped an 8-week program dedicated to motivated and busy men who want to lose weight. Let's face it, guys, when you lose weight, you feel more confident and you have higher self-esteem and you go out and you crush the world. You crush your goals and you start living your higher purpose. So if you're interested, DM me at Joel Evan Coaching or email me below, info@joelevancoaching.com. I'm here with Cameron George. He's the founder of TruKava, who after his own health challenges, drug addiction, autoimmunity, discovered the health benefits of Kava and attributes that plant as the source of his healing and getting his life back. Cameron George, welcome to the show, man.
Joel, thanks so much for having me, man.
Dude, I want to just jump in right there. I got a chance to chat with you at the Biohacking Congress event here in Silicon Valley about a month ago where you spoke, and when we got to talk a little bit when you were off the stage, you were telling me your story and how you got into it, and it's just a crazy story. Like I couldn't believe it. Like here you are, like a young athletic, you're a collegiate athlete, you're in good health. All of a sudden, your health's deteriorating. You got your autoimmunity. You're a drug addict. Like you were on a space of like, I mean, almost like no return. Like if someone were to hear your story, they'd be like, oh, this guy's not going to make it. He's not going to turn it around. I mean, we see where he's going. We see where this path is leading to. And out of nowhere, you pulled it through, man. And you were saying that Kava was the thing that did it for you, that like really brought you back. Can you kind of just tell everybody like how that whole story happened?
Oh man, yeah. It's I'll give you kind of the pseudo truncated version, right? Because we
Yeah.
could be here for quite a long
Yeah.
time with that. That's always the thing. But I really do think that our stories are important. I talk to a lot of amazing people, sort of in this health and wellness, like personal development space, and almost everybody has a story because most of this sort of this large category of material that we end up sort of delving into at the level that we do, you almost never do that like just by choice, right? It's usually either out of inspiration or desperation, like one of the two,
Yeah.
right? You either have a loved one who's going through something tremendous, a tremendous form of adversity, or your back is up against the wall and you're forced to do that in order to survive, which is exactly where I come from. I mean, I had both along the way. I definitely had both of those things. I had my own process, and then after living in this world today where we have so much chronic disease and so many egregious health challenges, you can't throw a stick without hitting someone without severe cancer, autoimmune disease, or obesity, diabetes, any of those things, and suffering tremendously from it, or psychiatric disorders. So for me, it's like, and once you go through it yourself, you connect way more with people going through those things, obviously, and you feel it a lot more, and and so I've definitely had an accumulation of motivation and inspiration as well, along the way as time has gone on. But it is important because our stories are what make us who we are, and that's why I'm here today doing what I'm doing, and that's why anyone who's doing any of this work is as well too. So yeah, for me, it was really what I kind of call a pain to purpose journey. I mean, I got severely sick like in my early 20s at a really early age. You wouldn't expect, especially back 10, 15 years ago. Now things are really starting to explode as far as chronic disease. And so it's becoming a little bit more commonplace, but especially back then, you wouldn't expect someone who was, a collegiate elite athlete and high functioning person to get that sick at that
Yeah.
age. You expect
Yeah.
people to be a little bit more resilient to chronic disease. But for me, almost every single time one of these really, when the bottom falls out on your health, in what I've seen since and with my own process, it was really pretty much kind of what we call a perfect storm, meaning it's like you see in the movie, a bunch of perfect fronts came together and just made this sort of explosive disaster of a situation. And so, like, for me, it was Susceptible genetics, definitely. I had the susceptible genetic pathways that predisposed me to accumulating neurotoxicity and inflammation in my body, maybe some weak detox pathways, or maybe some inherited traumas and mutated genes and things, from some generational stuff, and then toxic exposures when I was young. Possibly, had a susceptibility to the potentially egregious effects of like over vaccination, and I was part of that first sort of wave of individuals who got those back in the late 80s. Plus at that time when I was a kid was whenever we really, really pumped up the amount of glyphosate that, which is the active ingredient in the chemical Roundup, that just we started just bolstering on our food supply. I also grew up kind of in the late 80s, early 90s, where snacking first became like a massive thing, right? Where everyone was eating Pop Tarts
Yes.
and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, so it was like sugar, sugar, sugar. And so I got down that road of addiction pretty early on top of those things. So you have all those basic things that come together, and it primes you just enough if you're someone like myself, where you have enough physiological or emotional or chemical trauma that you end up with an underlying deficit in your nervous system. And, a lot of times people with, say, like, different types of neural wiring that has a propensity towards like impulsivity, for example, which was myself, are people who have these underlying deficits that are unconsciously trying to self-correct, and so you're chasing these sort of dopamine-seeking behaviors to try to compensate for a metabolic deficit that's not there, to try to stimulate your brain to give you the chemistry that it doesn't have.
Yeah.
And so you don't know that at the time. Like, I'm not like a kid saying, I need some more dopamine, give me some of that, you know.
Yeah.
but you're just trying to feel better, and you just realize, when I do this, I feel good. When I do this, I feel good. When I eat this sugar, I feel great, and blah blah blah. Whenever I do this thing, or whenever I make people laugh, or whenever I do this kind of thing, so you end up developing kind of this impulsive framework that is has a proclivity towards the addictive, right? Side of things. And
Yeah.
then that creates what I call a trajectory of toxic compensatory strategies, right? Because when we talk about addiction, addiction is never the problem in anybody's life, right? Addiction is your attempt to solve the problem, whether you know it or not, right? It's a response to pain, it's a response to trauma. And so, it starts off with doing things like that all of us were exposed to, like the bad eating and those kind of addictive behaviors. And then it leads to, with this kind of negative feedback loop process, where that damages the system even further. It was already vulnerable, and now you've engaged in all of these egregious habits that have depleted you more, that haven't filled you up and created more health and helped to correct the underlying deficit that was there, or process the traumas, or any of those things. But you've now added more inflammation to the system, leading for a greater need to, sort of upping your game on your on your compensation sort of addiction patterns,
Yeah.
which leads to trying to chase more sort of accelerated dopaminergic like behaviors, right? So, you could say like an adrenaline junkie type behavior, or, just, once you get to a certain age, food turns into alcohol, which turns into drugs, which turns into this and that. I got into, you know a pretty, egregious addictive situation, even with drugs and alcohol, at a pretty early age. I mean, 16. I mean, I got into all kinds of stuff, right? Cocaine, amphetamines, those kind of things, because it was put in front of me.
Yeah.
And my life broke down pretty quickly for a short time, and I always wanted to do the right thing. So I pivoted from that when things got really nasty, and really focused all of my efforts towards competitive endurance sports. So that was kind of like my safe, what I considered a respectable crutch, right? Something that was like, that still gave me that thing. I still didn't know how to deal with any of my underlying symptoms or to rehabilitate my system, but I thought that if I could redirect myself to something where I had a sense of purpose, and had a goal, and still gave me that sort of drug release that I was looking for, then I would do that. And so I started pretty early on that trajectory, and I sort of, that was my sport of choice, was competitive distance running. I mean, I was a triathlete too, but mainly competitive distance running, and I did that for, all through my teens and into college, and then on a professional level. I mean, I was racing, obviously, track and field, and then I was, competitive marathon runner, qualified for the Olympic trials pretty early on.
Wow.
But things got to my early 20s, and I was doing all that, and obviously it got to the point where I was overtraining because me being the person that I was at that time, I didn't ever really have a sense of balance, and because my system was already kind of fragile metabolically going into it, it was kind of only a matter of time.
Yeah.
And as I sort of went farther and farther down the road, the more like depleted I got, the more I overtrained, the more that I needed to just give myself stimulation to keep myself going. And whether it be massive amounts of caffeine or the continued with the foods and the sugar and the stimulation and this and that. And it got to a point where in my early 20s when I was like running competitively and stuff, I was running about 150 miles a week,
Jesus.
in hard miles, usually high intensity miles for most of those. And I was working 2 to 3 jobs, and I was, still in school and all these things. And the bottom just basically fell out. So all these fronts finally came together, and the bottom just basically like fell out to where I was just toasted. I ended up on the couch, and I just thought, well, I'm overtraining, blah, 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 and then so I took a little bit of time off, and then I didn't get better, right? That turned into taking more time off. And then, eventually I just wasn't recovering. And then I just thought, well, it's a moral failure. I must just be weak.
Yeah.
And that sort of led to me, sort of extending that out further a little bit longer. And eventually I ended up in a psychiatrist's office, like most people do, especially back then before we had sort of this more awareness in this realm that we now call biohacking, where we have all this body of information out there of ways that you can improve your energy levels and deal with some of your underlying health issues. And again, I'm actually from a part of the country that is less progressive on those ideas to begin with. I'm from Arkansas, so it's not, things take a little bit longer to to reach down here. And so at the time, my only medium, or my only sort of trajectory where the culture was pushing me, was if you have a problem, it's either A, a moral failing, or B, it's a psychiatric condition, right?
Yeah.
And it's like if you go to a doctor and you're not dying right there, and they don't have like a severe pathology that they can see on like a CT scan or like an MRI, which is totally like the wrong assessment. That's like if you have a tumor, a lesion, or like end stage something, then you must be 100% well. And if you're not doing well, then it's a moral failing or a psychiatric condition, right? Because
Yeah.
it was totally allopathic here. It was an allopathic disease model of medicine instead of a build health model of medicine, right? Meaning that it's like, yeah, if you're not dying right here in front of me, then there's nothing I can do for you, right? It's like I can
Yeah.
give you a drug or a surgery. So I ended up in a psychiatrist's office. Of course, they prescribed me a whole host of different, goodies, drugs that the main one being an amphetamine drug that most people are aware of called Adderall. And that's one of those drugs that was the drug that basically like did me in, because if you have a system that's already, say, overheated, like just like if you've got a car that's overheated and the engine is really weak and it's already running too hot and it's very, very depleted, the worst thing you could possibly do is to put jet fuel in it and just fire the hell out of it. And that's like what you're doing. Like if you take like a system that's metabolically void, right, or that's metabolically damaged and that's toasted, and then you just throw some amphetamines in the tank, right? You're gonna be better the next day, right? For a while, right? It's like, because you're just basically like charging your energy systems on credit, right? You're like borrowing from tomorrow to pay for today, and you're borrowing from your deep energy survival stores, and you get that energy now, but you're not creating anymore. You're just releasing, and you're just using up what you really can't afford to spare. And that's really the story of stimulants, the story of drugs in general. Um, but that was the situation I ended up in. So I bought into that model, started taking it. It's like, oh my gosh, I feel good, I feel better, you know. And so I went down that road. But the problem is that I was my it totally changed my personality going on these drugs, because obviously it led to taking extremely high doses pretty quick, and that it altered my personality and my perception in a way that's hard to describe if you've never experienced anything like that. But basically, you can't create a biochemical balance with psychotropic drugs in your brain. You just can't, because the body's natural intelligence is going to self-regulate. And so if you try to, intervene at one chemical pathway like you do with dopamine, say with amphetamines, you're going to get an instant gratification. You're going to bolster up a certain pathway, but then at the cost of all these other pathways. And so, like with amphetamines, if you have high doses of them, or if you already have a system that's running a little bit too hot and then you put amphetamines in it, you can easily go manic, right? Or you can, you have a suppression of empathy and of forethought and of all these different things. And if it goes long enough, you can end up in what's called an amphetamine induced psychosis, which is what I kind of ended up in. So basically, my life was pretty standard besides all the disease problems that I had, going into taking those drugs. When I started taking amphetamines and a whole host of other different drugs, but mainly the amphetamines, um, 3 to 4 months later, my life looked almost indistinguishable from a meth addict.
Yeah.
I almost immediately started my behavior changed. I started doing these wildly impulsive things. Um, I went on crazy buying sprees. I charged hundreds of thousands of dollars of credit, and on top of the money that I was already making. I was working at an electronics store at the time, and I started buying and flipping all of these electronics in a legal way, but it was sort of like this like amphetamine fueled like hustle type of thing that I was on. And then
Yeah.
I ended up buying a bunch of like exotic animals, like doing just like crazy things. Like I had an apartment, I had monkeys and dogs and like parrots, and I had like a fish tank full of piranhas in there. Like it totally just led me into this. It was like this nightmare. I always tell people this. It was like a good cross between like Ace Ventura and Breaking Bad, right? Because it led me to start connecting with a whole host of different people, because that's what happens when you get on a different wavelength and you're in that sort of lower vibrational wavelength that is sort of this lower conscious sort of just like fight or flight thing. So I started connecting with people who were like drug addicts, right? Because I basically
Yep.
was then at that point, a pharmaceutically induced, like allopathically induced drug addict. And so it created all these negative circumstances. I had all this money and I was charging it and blah, blah, blah. And I had, it's like the party and the people and the animals. And I got, drug addicts like sleeping on my floor. I don't even know, like eating pizza off the floor. It's like crazy stuff. Like it just devolved into this like nightmare. It could just go on and on about where that went. You can imagine. Um, and yeah, I mean, so basically, it's like I thought my life was on a not steady ground beforehand. So obviously my
Yeah.
life broke down pretty much completely through these circumstances, right? So because of what the amphetamines were doing to me, plus the toxic circumstances of like having the animals in my apartment, and it turns out that I had like actually a bad case of stachybotrys in this apartment that I was in as well too.
Wow.
And like my animals started dying, monkeys started dropping like flies. It's like a which it was pretty gnarly, right? And so um so my toxic burden just started to increase and increase even more, and eventually even the drugs that I was on stopped working and my system crashed. I thought that it was crashed before. It crashed. It's like I thought that I had, cognitive dysfunction and brain fog, but at this point this all wiped me out, and I eventually ended up in a place where it was like brain dead, like actually couldn't get out of bed, and
Yeah.
actually had like chemically induced brain damage from all of the ammonia buildup from the animal feces in my apartment, or
Jesus.
the amphetamines, and and the stachybotrys and the mold that was literally like killing my animals. So it was like this crazy perfect storm. Plus all these crazy things happen. I started connecting with all these different people, got a bunch of emotional trauma. I had like thousands of dollars like stolen from me. Like I had like everything taken from me through like a variety of different means, and then did plenty myself as well too to destroy what was left. Um, and so basically I ended up not only with nothing, I ended up with less than nothing, because not I didn't have any money. I actually owed massive amounts of money at that point, right? And I owed on my body's own energy supply. I was in debt with that too. In other words,
Yeah.
I didn't have even the means to work anymore at a certain point, right, where I had less than nothing. So the one thing that I did have was I had an amazing support system. I mean, one of the best you could imagine, in my parents, and in the rest of my family, who basically came in, and once they kind of realized what was going on, they came in and basically took me in and basically kept me alive over the next several years while I was scouring medical and scientific literature just to find a way out of this horrific circumstance, which actually got way worse once the system was down. I kept deteriorating because now I wasn't stable anymore. I was actually going down and down, even though I stopped all of these things and I got off all the drugs. This neurotoxic sort of dysbiotic, this autoimmune process that I had started had, like an inertia of its own, and I continued to deteriorate and pretty rapidly. But I basically spent the next 8 years completely dysfunctional, unable to drive, unable to basically go anywhere. Eventually, I lost the ability to walk. My cognitive
Wow.
dysfunction was so bad at one point, which is hard for people to imagine kind of now whenever I speak with people and things. But it was so bad that I couldn't leave my house in the neighborhood that I grew up in, and even go for a walk around the block without getting confused on where I was at least a few different times.
Jesus.
I was getting to where I couldn't recognize people in my family. Like I would look at them and like it would take like, but my own parents. I was just in this crazy void with like this chemically induced brain damage. I actually ended up getting a SPECT imaging brain scan, just like Daniel Amen and his clinics do. But I got it in
Yeah.
Louisiana when I went down to do hyperbaric oxygen for the first time. And the radiologist said that my brain was comparable to 80-year-old patients that he sees with full blown dementia. Which
Whoa.
was he? I mean, it was one of those things that he was like, "You have the best camouflage I've ever seen. Like, I don't know how you're talking to me or even carrying on a conversation. Like, this is like the scan of like a of what I would see from like a severe drug addict, like sleeping under a bridge, like completely homeless kind of thing, or an 80-year-old with dementia, either one." So it was like, and that didn't surprise me at all. It was good to have that scan because then everyone in my family could see like, hey, this is for real, which they already
Yeah.
knew, but it was good to have that at that point. But no, so it was a disaster of a situation. So I basically pulled together and mussed together every bit of energy, focus, motivation, inspiration. A few things happened at that time. I had been through so much at this point that I just kind of found this level of inspiration where I wanted to. I had a deep fundamental value for life, and I really believe that it was kind of worth giving everything you have to fight for, not only for myself, but I don't live in a vacuum. If I don't make it, then it destroys my family in a lot of ways, and so it was kind of like for all of us. It was like, for me to get my health back. This whole thing put a huge financial burden on my family because they had to come in and like save me like financially, and it put them in massive debt and everything like that. So it was
Yeah.
just like it was like we were all sort of banded together like a team to try to save us all, and then eventually it formed into a greater purpose of then trying to be part of more larger macro solutions on many different levels, right? But I spent like the next probably 8 or 9 years just mustering every bit of energy that I had, even though I couldn't leave my house or do hardly anything, just scouring medical and scientific literature and just connecting with doctors and researchers and scientists and trying to assimilate this picture of not only how I got where I was at, but first of all, I had to go back to square one and learn like what health was, like what creates health, right? And how did I
Yeah.
end up with a loss of health? And all of these things that this terminology that we know of today, everything from understanding metabolism and mitochondria to brain chemistry, I went through this education process where I did nothing but just learn for years, right? Basically lived in a cocoon and did nothing but just do that. And eventually pieced together. I met some fantastic individuals. Went down a lot of trails that like led me nowhere. Like obviously exhausted a lot of different trajectories, but finally ended up getting connected with a team of functional medicine doctors, and one in particular who helped me take everything that I had learned and sort of put to get it together in a system. And that system, working that system for a long enough period of time, not overnight, not weeks, not months, but years, is what eventually allowed me to turn the tide from disease into health and to accelerate the recovery and the regenerative process to where eventually I fully got my life back. But it took, because it's not individual things, it's not one even treatment or therapy or modality or supplement or anything like that that gets a person their life back, but it's systems, right? And
Yeah.
so this is sort of how I came across Kava, was because whenever I was at my worst, I had deteriorated so substantially to a point where I was, a lot of times in these bad autoimmune conditions of today, we see a lot of hypersensitivity and reactivity that develops in people's nervous systems and their immune systems. And the reason is because it's a form of PTSD. If the body's a metaphorical bucket and every stress or trauma that you've been exposed to is a drop in the bucket, once your bucket fills up, then you end up in a chronic disease process of your genetic weakness. And some people express as different depending on what your body is genetically set up for, most predisposed to. But once the bucket fills up, the body is basically traumatized and can't handle anymore because it says, you've hurt me this much, and now I want to start rejecting things. Plus, a lot of times, a lot of people today, pretty much every disease that we see begins in the gut. And what we have today is like 99% of people have what's called gut permeability and leaky gut syndrome, where because of drugs and chemicals and because of sugar, bad foods, and all kinds of stuff, we get a breakdown of the gut lining to where everything that we're exposed to and eating after a certain point is crossing into the bloodstream prematurely. And the immune system is going, whoa, what the hell is this? That's not supposed to cross in here. And it primes it over time. And that's why we have so much autoimmunity, is because it creates this global chronic inflammation, which I like to think of chronic irritation, that leads to this explosion of inflammation and perpetuates disease. But so I ended up in this hyper reactive state where I was so bad that I was reacting to everything that I was eating and everything that I was drinking, which is actually, that was when I was at my worst. And it was actually one of the things that almost led me to lose my life, because I became so reactive that I was literally going into a full grandma seizure like 10 times a day from everything that I was eating. So I just, like, couldn't eat anymore.
Jesus.
And eventually I started even reacting to water, which I didn't even know was friggin' possible, which it's just, I was that reactive that even the minerals in the water and even this and that, or whatever, I would put water on my tongue and I would go into a seizure. And these things got to the point where they were lethal, because it was like I was that weak, and having a seizure was becoming extremely dangerous. And I'd get anaphylaxis too sometimes with some of the reactions. I just literally couldn't breathe. For and I couldn't take anything to stop it. An EpiPen would make it would kill me at that point. It would make it worse because the nervous system thing. So it was, it was beyond terrifying. But basically, I ended up on high doses. The only thing that I could take, they were able to get it in my system to stop it, was high doses of benzodiazepines. So benzodiazepines are the anti-anxiety, anxiolytic drugs that are sort of like the most heavily prescribed drugs in that category. Think drugs like Xanax and Klonopin and Ativan. There's an epidemic not only of prescription use of these drugs, but also off-label sort of street use, buying and selling of these drugs today, because people are so traumatized, and anxiety is such an explosive issue in our culture, and sleeplessness and everything, that people migrate towards these drugs. We hear of the opiate epidemic, but the benzo epidemic is almost just as big, and
Yeah.
many people die from it, and it ruins people's lives because these drugs are highly addictive, and they're a disaster. They're toxic for brain chemistry, for brain metabolism, and it's just a disaster long term. Acutely, it's one thing, but problematic. But I ended up on them because I had to be on them. And I had been down this road with Adderall. I knew what was happening. I knew they were going to lose their effectiveness. And when they did, and when they started to, then I would have a rebounding effect where my seizures would amplify even worse. In which, at that point, my seizures were already at a lethal level. So if my benzos lost their effectiveness and I ricocheted in the opposite direction, then I wasn't going to make it. It was that level of a situation.
Yeah.
So I was working with one of these functional medicine physicians, and we were trying to find a strategy to get off benzodiazepines, a safe strategy, right? And honestly, on paper, I mean, I was going to keep fighting with it, but on paper, I didn't think I was going to find it,
Yeah.
because because it was just, I was that weak and I couldn't tolerate hardly anything. So, but for me, I had been down this road for years, and I had studied the whole sort of plant pharmacopoeia and the ethnobotanical world and everything, and I was looking for a plant-based, non-addictive, non-toxic alternative, an analog, a replacement that's used as a tapering agent for a benzodiazepine. Okay, right? So obviously I went the whole medical cannabis route. That didn't work for me. The pathways aren't the same. It doesn't work that well for that. For some people, it works for anxiety. THC just made me feel worse. It made the anxiety worse. Didn't stop my seizures.
Mm.
So that wasn't a deal. And then you have all the sort of basic, like, over-the-counter compounds that hit on the same receptors as benzos, but they just lightly sort of dust the receptors, and benzos hit them with a sledgehammer. So like the passion flowers and the valerian roots and the lemon balms, there's nothing
Yeah.
wrong with any of these herbs, chamomile. But it's like, in my situation, it was a little bit like shooting a BB gun at a freight train. It's
Yeah.
it was not gonna, it
It's
wasn't
not
gonna do
doing
it.
anything. Yeah.
So I was going over basically the literature, and I kept coming across Kava. I had tried what I thought was Kava before, so I kind of overlooked it whenever I was in this emergency situation because I had tried what's known in the U.S. as Kava, which are these little capsules that you can get at health food stores. Not even all health food stores; only some have them. But um, and I had read about Kava and tried those years ago, and to me it was something, but it was just mildly sedating, kind of like a cup of chamomile tea.
Yeah.
And so I was like, well, that's not going to do it. I came across, one of my contacts was an indigenous person from islands in the South Pacific, uh, from well, the first one was from Vanuatu, and he told me, he was like, well, have you tried Kava? I was like, yes, I've tried Kava. He's like, well, it's like the obvious choice. It hits on those receptors and blah blah. Blah. And I'm like, well, I've tried Kava, and he's like, well, what'd you try? And I told him, and he laughed. I mean, he wasn't trying to laugh at my situation, but it was kind of like it's funny to them, right?
Yeah.
Like
That's a
because
cute kid.
he's like, no, you haven't. That's not Kava. By definition, that's not Kava. Kava, by definition, is the water and pressure extracted, traditionally prepared drink elixir prepared from the fresh or or slow dried roots of this shrub called Piper methysticum, which is kava. It's a shrub that grows in the South Pacific Islands, and that's what they call kava. It's the complete constituent mixture. What we have in the United States, they're calling kava kava, is not that. It's a kava like product where they use Western extraction methodologies, solvents like ethanol, or sometimes even like acetone or egregious like hexane and stuff,
Yeah.
and these solvents only bind to a few of the active constituents and just sort of skirt off a little bit of them. And whenever you extract them in these methods and create these little tinctures, it kills like 90% of the effects. These are kava-like products, and they're no more like kava than a caffeine pill is coffee, or you know, cocaine is coca tea from Peru, right?
Yeah.
Except for that's not even a great comparison because at least cocaine still works, or
Yeah.
you know what I
You
mean?
can.
Even if it has all these side effects, and coca tea doesn't. So it takes it out of its context, but kava, it loses its effectiveness and it makes it potentially egregious whenever you imbalance it and denature it like that,
Yeah.
potentially. Um, so I was like, okay, perfect, right? Because I knew that what I was reading in the anthropological accounts, where these people in the South Pacific saw kava as like their most sacred commodity, their most sacred substance. They used it for weddings, funerals, spiritual ceremonies, social gatherings, and they were saying all these things about it, that it had these entheogenic effects, that it had these what we would call nootropic effects. They called it like clearing the mind and improving memory and stuff. And they used it as this intense relaxation that they would use as a replacement, or an alternative to alcohol, which they had it before alcohol. They use alcohol sometimes, they skirt it in, but mainly use
Mm.
kava. And I was like, before I met this guy, I was like, I had tried these kava capsules. I'm like, what are they talking about? Like that's nonsense. So he sends me some of the dry root, okay, and he tells me how to prepare it. I put it in this strainer bag, and I'm kneading it into this bowl of water for like 30, 45 minutes. And that's how you prepare it, like traditionally, which is fine, in the islands, and it's good like for a ceremonial standpoint, but it
Yeah.
takes time. It takes time, and it gets everything disgusting in your kitchen, and you end up with this bowl of muddy water, right? And so, but which at the time, look, I'll drink,
Of
I don't,
course.
I'll drink away, right? And it tastes god awful, but I was like, I started drinking it, and within a week, I started to notice effects immediately, but there's a cumulative effect to kava that you got to give it some time for to reach its full effectiveness. But I tried it for about a week, and within like a week, I was noticing profound improvements in my sleep and stuff. Within 2 weeks, my all my reactions and my spasticity, my convulsions had reduced by like 80%. So I was
Wow.
blown away. And then after 2 months, I was off of my benzos completely, which is like that is like that, if you're someone who's been in benzo addiction, like that like defies logic, right? It seems impossible because these drugs, for the average person, if you've been on them for years, they take like a year and a half of a slow taper, and some people don't even get it in that period of time,
Mm.
right? If you can do it at all. So I was off them completely, so I'm just like absolutely blown away. And understanding the pharmacology of kava, it binds to the exact same receptors in the brain that benzodiazepines and alcohol do, plus
Wow.
many others. It binds to all of your your main neurotransmitter receptors that are related to pleasure and mood and focus and memory retention and even empathy and creativity and stuff. So
And
it but
Cameron,
its
that's what you
primary
would call
pathway is the
the cavalectones, right? Which is like
yes,
that's
right.
like
Yeah.
hitting
So
on
the
the
active constituents are these oil-like compounds that whenever you squeeze the kava or whenever you produce it, you extract them without damaging them, hopefully. And they're these little lipids, yeah, that are called kavalactones. And there's 18 total known kavalactones plus a bunch of other enzymatic constituents. It's this whole matrix of living
so
constituents that
incredible.
work in synergy like a musical orchestra.
Yeah.
And you got to have the whole thing together to get the effects. If you start isolating things, it's like taking one instrument out of an orchestra, and it's not the full experience at all.
It
Um,
reminds me too of what you said about the fact that it's a system, right? Like when you heal yourself, you can't just take one thing to stimulate dopamine and one thing to stimulate GABA. Like Kava, it seems like, is working on all of these in a very organic and like very systematic, kind of like beautiful musical way, like you're describing.
yes, yeah. I mean, it really is sort of synchronistic, very sort of harmonious effect that you get, on this on the system, right? I mean, it's a modulatory agent, but it also is an elevator of spirit and an elevator of mood. But then it's also a grounding and it's also a neuro and tissue protective agent as well. So it's grounding,
Yes.
but at the same time, it elevates you. It elevates your mind, but it brings about a state of calm, centered focus and like elevated spirit, if that makes sense, right? So
Yeah.
you would think of something that elevates you as like jacking you up, but no, it's like elevation in the true sort of creative sort of centered sense, right? It's like an alpha state. It induces like sort of like an alpha state, whereas where people access like maximum creativity and functionality at the same time. These beta states that stimulants put you in more of a fight or flight state, which suppresses creativity and allows it kind of disconnects you from your higher brain function. It disables some of the left right hemisphere connection and puts you in more of sort of a an analytical get things done, run away from the tiger kind of thing, like it's like
Mm.
that fight or flight hamster wheel. So you can't really you have less access to like the totality of your psyche and perspective on where the current moment that you reside in sort of relates to all of the coexisting sort of moments, both in the immediate and distant past and even what planning for the future. You're kind of stuck in this mode where you're just kind of reacting more the more you stimulate yourself into beta, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like stimulates a reactive state. A lot of like stimulants do, especially synthetic stimulants. I mean, which is why people can go into full blown like delusional psychosis with these really powerful like stimulants like amphetamines. But so kava, the main three things that it's most known for is relaxation, mood, and mental clarity, right? So like I said, that calm, sort of enhanced state of sobriety, and it's able to like lift your mood and like in high doses induce a state of like euphoria that's very similar to alcohol without the drunkenness. So it creates this like place, this calm centered space where it induces this introspective thinking, this creative thinking, this social interaction, this empathy, social lubrication. So, high doses of kava are really great for like, connecting with people in a very intent and focused way, right? I mean, like it's the perfect. That's why like in the islands they have kava bars. Like,
Yeah.
in the ancient tradition they drank it in the villages, but they have kava bars now and they prefer it over alcohol. In Vanuatu and Fiji, they've got 20 times as many kava bars as they have regular bars because it allows them to get into that very genuine state of, community and connection with other people, and it brings people together without making their behavior more progressively primitive the more they consume, like alcohol does. Right? It's like
Yeah.
alcohol a little bit, okay, and then you get to a certain point where now you're not connecting at a higher level, you're connecting, but it's on a lower level, right? It's like
Yeah.
it's more reactive, it's more just like it gets nonsensical the more that you like, and then you don't,
Yeah.
so
Now you're
it's like
falling
there's
down.
yes, exactly. There's that
Yeah.
fine line in which it turns on you. In kava, it's kind of the opposite. The more you consume, the more deep and genuine the conversation gets. Like you have some of the most genuine, heartfelt, like focused conversations. It's an empathogen. It stimulates empathy.
Wow.
Like in the cultures in Vanuatu, which the chief is still kind of like reigns over like each village. If there's a dispute, between villagers, they're always forced to sit down and settle it over kava. The chief will enforce that. because it's that good at helping people connect and sort of see the other perspective, which you
Yeah,
can
so cool.
imagine the kind of application that has in today's world. A safe, non-addictive, non-toxic alcohol and drug alternative that can act as a tapering agent too, that
Yeah.
helps, that brings people together in that way, right? Like, so my whole thing with Kava is I started to see pretty quickly that, well, first of all, real Kava had no presence in the current marketplace at all, right?
Yeah.
So it wasn't here. It's just these little capsules that were not the same thing.
I mean, I've
And
never even really heard of Kava until you, Cameron. So I mean, that's just to me, and I'm into the health world, and I'm into the
yeah,
adaptogens and the CBD. Like I know all this stuff. I never heard of Kava until you. So
yeah, and it's crazy. You really have to turn over some stones, but I mean, Kava is probably one of the best hidden gems of anything. And look, it's like, you and I have both been in this for a long time, and we've looked and we dig and we like look at all of the biohacks, the supplements, the strategies, the therapies, and everything. And I can't say out of anything that I found as far as like compounds that you take, the I don't know if I know of any other compound that has a greater therapeutic effect to drawback ratio, right? There
yeah,
are some, it's like there are things like psilocybin that are profound, but they have a very limited spectrum of healthy contextual use, right? They need to be used very carefully, and you can't just give it to grandma. It's like that's a bad idea.
yeah.
Like, I mean, it takes
Oops, sorry,
intention. It
Grandma.
takes, yeah, exactly. You know what I mean? And it's like, and there are legality issues. You can have bad trips. The states are so intense. Kava actually has entheogenic effects like these psychedelics that are becoming popular, but without inducing like a trip altered state. It creates this left right hemisphere, connection
Mm,
that brings about a state of more all inclusive systems thinking. What do I mean by systems thinking? It means, those of you who are familiar with either psychedelic experiences or deep states of meditation, or any of these practices that people are trying to get into these alpha states and expand awareness and consciousness and become more centered, they know about this left right hemisphere interaction, right? Connecting the rational with the introspective and creative, and allowing both of those two things to become married, because most of us, especially in states of trauma, have a tendency to get pushed to one side or the other, which is it's part of the duality that's built into humans, which is why you see these two sides that manifest in our economics and politics and our perspectives on the world, is that
yeah,
whenever we're imbalanced, our life experiences usually tend to try to push us trauma does, into a dominance of one side or the other. The rational, the practical, the disciplinary, the structured side is the left side of the brain, which is actually more of the right side of the political spectrum of conservatism, of sort of preserving the values and the structure from the past and protecting it, because it's all about facts and right here and right now. And
yeah,
then the right side of the brain is more of the openness, the introspection, right, the empathy, all of those things. Not that the right doesn't have empathy, but it's more of those things, and that's more of what we see as like the left side of the political spectrum. And but the problem is, you go too far in either direction, you go too far to the left, and it's open, and you end up in a state where it's like anything goes, because
yep,
it's not grounded by the discipline, the structure, the practicality, the rationality, maybe the
yeah,
business sense. And on the right side, you get too secular, and you get cut off from like from changing and evolving and moving forward and becoming open to new ideas and things. So both of these have part of the answer, but it's what do we more prominently use at this given time for this given problem that's in front of us, or how do we fuse these two? So anyways, people that engage in these practices to try to expand their consciousness and create more of this sort of systems thinking, this all-inclusive sort of left-right, marriage hemisphere type of a state, obviously in their mind, where they train themselves to get into these states and to stay into these states. It allows it really breeds wisdom, and it breeds human growth and development, right?
mm,
Because there's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. uh, it's like knowledge, for example, like knowledge is having the practical and rational know-how of how to execute an individual step of some sort of microcraft that's right in front of you, right?
yep,
So for example, it takes tremendous knowledge to build an H-bomb, but it's not very wise. You know what I mean?
right,
Because wisdom is the ability to have that fusion of both the immediate practicality of what's right in front of you, but then fuse that into a larger contextual picture of what that action leads to from, a consequence standpoint, to be like, well, this leads to this, leads to this, leads to this, and how it affects the whole process of life around you, right? And what are the long-term consequences, both for you, your immediate environment, your family, your culture, all of those things. That's
Yeah.
wisdom. To be able to see the long-term consequences of your action, basically to be able to zoom out and to see the big picture is like wisdom. So you can
Yeah.
have knowledge in something. It's like, Bill Gates has a lot of knowledge, about,
Yeah.
software, about this or that. Me personally, I don't see much wisdom there because there's a lot of decisions that are being made. That's a, it's like, so there's a difference there, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I only say that because it's relevant to the topic of entheogenic substances and the reason why people are migrating towards them, and not just the entheogens, but any kind of disciplinary practice that leads people to a more heavily amplified sort of uh, integrated state of mind that I'm talking about here. This
Yeah.
left right, hemisphere sort of fusion, cognitive development type of stuff, which is what leads to, I believe, a greater sense of perspective, all inclusive perspective, and grounded kind of wisdom. Right.
Yeah.
All the people that I most respect in my life are people that have cultivated that through in intense work, self-reflection, and discipline and persistence. So
Amen,
that's
brother.
that kind of gives the
That's good.
context of why I think these things in these states are very important. So for me, as good as something like kava is, for just like the low-hanging fruit, like, oh, improve your sleep, like take the edge off your anxiety and all this kind of stuff, it's great for that. I see it as a tolerable entheogenic substance that can be introduced into the mass market as a commodity that can be as common as a cup of coffee,
Yeah.
that can help to have a positive net impact on the collective think and the collective psyche, the collective mind of our culture and others around the world. And I actually have good reason to think this, actually, because whenever you study cultures, over history, across history, and even the indigenous cultures that say uphold, kava, but if you just study cultures in general, from an anthropological standpoint, a lot of the highest values and aspirations of any collective culture ever in history are largely contributed to and shaped by the altered states of consciousness that they choose to engage in, which usually involves some form of psychoactive process, substance, medicine, or maybe not even medicine, like, something that's not medicinal but that still affects the altered state.
Yeah.
And the reason is the altered states are usually states that we use to disconnect, to try to bring a sense of community to come together, and that's where we really connect as humans, which is one of our highest aspirations, is to connect with one another, to get that sense of feeling and love and connection, which brings us to a passion and a sense of a desire and drive for higher purpose, which motivates us to do great things as human beings collectively, because we need that, right? Community
Totally.
is what breeds our personal growth, and greatness, or lack thereof, in some senses. But so if you look at cultures that embrace, say, highly entheogenic states of mind, or altered states induced by, say, plant medicines, like hunter-gatherer cultures or different cultures in the Amazon that embrace ayahuasca, in a very um, uh, you know, respectful and responsible sort of medium of use, or say psilocybin mushrooms or any of these, if that's their main mode of altered states, or like the Native Americans that embrace peyote or sweat lodges or things, they generally have a greater interconnection, a sense of the tribe, a sense of, love and connection to each other, not just me and my individual two people that I call my family, but the tribe is my family kind of thing, a sense of
Yeah.
community. But then also they have a sense of the sacred, of how sacred the living organism of the earth that they live on is, and that they understand that they're an extension of it, because they've gotten these perspectives through exploring these altered states, and connecting to environment, to source, whatever you call that source. You call it divine inspiration, spirit, truth, God, whatever, where it comes
Yeah.
from. But the origin of where we sort of come from, that sort of higher truth, it's like the highest expression of who we are as individuals or human beings. So cultures who embrace these kind of altered states of like entheogenic substances, it carries over into all of their values, because it creates that perspective, and the perspective is what creates all of the collective behavior, which sets the trajectory of where that culture goes. And as you start to see cultures across history sort of deviate in what I call nature divorcement syndrome,
Yeah.
In many ways, it's because they've deviated from the states of consciousness that connect them to each other in the natural ecology and moved into altered states that are like heavily induced by, say, alcohol. Like in the
Yeah.
West, we embraced alcohol, and alcohol is more of it's less entheogenic and more antheogenic, meaning that it tends to put you in a lower vibrational state, not in small doses. There's a way that you can do it, but it's certainly not entheogenic, even in
Yeah.
those. But it tends to induce, like alcohol and stimulants and nicotine are these, they induce these beta states of consciousness that are all about productivity and the suppression of empathy, and they don't value and accelerate the development of this interconnected sort of community mentality, connection to nature, reverence for nature, understanding that you're part of nature, that you don't reign over it. All these perspectives that come out, that are starting to come out more, which is why people are being drawn to these substances. So I say all of that because I truly believe that introducing safe, tolerable means of allowing people, tools, all tools, not just, this, but, all tools that allow people to sort of cultivate more of that and to sort of reintegrate themselves with that collective sort of that, that intelligence, right? That intelligence that comes from these introspective states. I believe, if you can do that on a large scale, I think that it has a positive, a potentially positive net impact on the collective perspective and the psyche. And, for me, Kava is that perfect balance that can be fully integrated into every layer of the infrastructure, just like coffee. It can be as common as a cup of coffee, but deliver people a kind of in the background sort of, medicinal component to their psyche, which we know people in the South Pacific have always known and said that people who drink kava regularly, there's a cumulative effect where not only do they become more balanced from a nervous system standpoint over time, they become more introspective and empathetic over time, right? We
Mm.
know now that even substances like psilocybin, which have a smaller spectrum of use, when you take them, they increase neurogenesis, and they complexify people's thinking, and they create higher empathetic and introspective states. That the longer you spend in these states, it creates new neurological structures or roadways that solidify and become permanent, right? And so over time, it helps to reshape the psyche because you're in this introspective state all the time. So it accelerates. It tends to accelerate personal growth when used properly. Um,
Yeah.
and kava is one of those things that doesn't have the potential for negative trips. It just has this sort of psychologically medicinal effect on so many levels. And aside from that, it has all of these physiological effects that are so relevant, and just as an alternative to drugs and alcohol. I work in a network of a couple thousand functional medicine doctors, and the amount of cases that I've seen for people easily getting off of benzodiazepines is just astounding. And
Wow.
alcohol, and in a time where we're in the most traumatic time in human history, and even before COVID, but now COVID and everything, where obviously addiction is going through the roof, suicide is going through the roof, mental illness is going through the roof. I mean,
Yeah.
more than through the roof. I mean, it's going boom. I mean, it's exploding, and we're under a level of trauma and fear and human suffering, and we need as many tools and strategies as we can to bring ourselves back to baseline, to keep ourselves centered, to keep ourselves connected to one another, to keep ourselves open and understanding, and to have safe means of dealing with our stress and trauma that don't put us into escapism, addiction, and toxicity. And
Yeah.
so that's generally what I see, as far as Kava's place in the world and in the marketplace, and that's sort of why we're at the point where we are with it.
Dude, that was beautiful. Just some of the things that you were just talking about, it just made me realize that kava is the way you describe it, and it's way more than just like, oh, take this pill, or take this supplement. Like you said, it has so much roots in its like history and like and how it affects the culture scape, or it could. It's more than just a pill or a supplement, and that was I get that. That is so cool. Thank you.
Yeah, man. Yeah, yeah, for sure. It was something that kind of crept up on me because I was taking it just for a very specific purpose at first. And like the indigenous people have always said, they're like, well, it has all these other multi-layered effects. It's this multi-layered physical, psychological, emotional, even spiritual medicine. and it's one that almost anybody can tolerate, right? It's like sometimes the best medicine isn't the one that hits you over the head the hardest with a sledgehammer, but it's the one that can be taken regularly over time to where the therapeutic effects and even the lessons from a psychological standpoint can be slowly integrated to where it can kind of whisper it at you, and you can there's room for integration because it's soft, it's gentle in the system, and it kind of gets in there and it kind of embraces you and wraps around you and it gives this protective effect, allows you to start sleeping better in many cases, boosts your mood without having to put sugar or addictive stimulants in your brain. Turns your brain on, which is just tremendous. We know it has all of these other various applications that enhance and increase fat burning and
Ooh, I
cellular
want to talk about that.
autophagy.
Yeah. Can you talk about weight
Yeah,
loss and kava?
yeah, absolutely. That's like one of its lesser known mechanisms because people in the South Pacific really didn't think or care that much about that. But that's something that got sort of vetted out in the scientific literature in the past 20 years. Kava is actually one of the most studied herbs in the world outside of cannabis and ginseng. A lot of people don't realize that because a lot of people don't even know what it is. But
Yeah.
there's huge interest in the ethnobotanical community with it. Now, one of the main pathways that's the highest of interest is this pathway. These fat burning pathways. So we know that substances like coffee and MCT oil have become extremely popular for getting energy into the brain without having to put glucose in there. So it makes like intermittent fasting easier, or people that are trying to become more metabolically flexible into using their own fat stores as their main source of fuel. Um, those are tools that have become very popular. Kava is sort of that missing ingredient that not a lot of people know about that I think is just as efficient as those two for that purpose. And for me personally, it was even more efficient at suppressing my appetite, getting me calm and focused, turning my brain on without affecting my blood glucose. And then we find out in the scientific literature that it actually helps to not only burn fat and mobilize free fatty acids, but also induce cellular autophagy. That means the recycling of old bad cells into usable energy as fuel. And actually, one of Kava's most well-studied applications is against cancer and metabolic diseases. That's actually
Wow.
where a lot of the excitement is with it. And we can't make any claims around it there because we're just talking about disease process and how it's been studied, but it has extreme interest around it. So it powerfully activates a pathway called AMPK. That's the adenosine monophosphate activated protein kinase pathway. It's a mouthful, but basically it's a fat burning pathway. Basically, it stimulates the body into this mode, what we call like a recycling mode. It shifts the body into this recycling mode like a switch, where the body says, okay, it's mimicking like a state of fasting, where it's telling the body that there's not any food coming in, even if there is in the state of kava. It's kind of like a hack in that regard, but it tells it to start, it tells it to start recycling its own stored body fat in the form of energy, its own energy in the form of body fat and bad old tissues, and breaking them down and using them as fuel instead of looking for an external fuel source. And that's very good. And that's something that we know today is actually a crucial missing ingredient in the average sort of, uh, you know, approach to health, both in the Western world and everywhere around the world, is spending time not eating, or spending time where you're forcing your body to eat out its bad tissues and eat out its stored body fat. And then also going into periods of time where you're actually re-stimulating some of these sort of glycolytic pathways and this mTOR pathway that's all about growth and regeneration, right? So I mean, everything in health is about cycles, obviously, right? If you these people that get caught in these camps of like, oh, you need to be keto all of the time forever till the end of time, and my
Right.
ketones are higher than yours and I'm cooler than you and all this kind of stuff, you know like it's like there's a time and place, and it's phenomenal. There's also a time and a place for most people to cycle out of that, right? To get out of
Right.
that cellular autophagy fat burning state and stimulate some of that insulin, stimulate some of that new healthy growth, and the proliferation of stem cells and new tissues and muscle growth and all this kind of stuff. But then not spend too much time in that, because then you support too much growth and you get senescent cells and potentially cancer, right?
Yep.
But anyways, so kava really supports this cellular autophagy pathway in a modulatory way. It doesn't push it too far in one way or another, but it tends to. So there are powerful effects on that fat burning pathway that stimulates the burning of fat, but then also suppresses that mTOR pathway as well too. And then there are these extra compounds, these little chalcone, these extra sort of plant defense compounds that are tolerable to the human system. in kava that are have been substantially shown to be powerfully apoptotic towards senescent cells. So those are precancerous cells. So not only does it help the body naturally sort of eat out these bad cells and eat out the stored body fat, but it also has extra sort of natural chemotherapeutic compounds that have been shown to be highly toxic selectively to senescent and cancerous cells as well too. So
Wow.
kava, its general um, sort of signature from a philosophical perspective, the indigenous people would say, it has two basic signatures. The first one is kava as a protective substance. And the reason why I say this is because it's relevant to this thing about fat burning, stress protection, all this kind of stuff. All these pathways, a lot of people say, well, how can one thing be so good for so many different things?
Yeah, seriously.
Because it's a living organism, just like if you were to take a human body. How is a human body so great at doing different things? It's so great at digesting food. It's so great at pumping the heart. It's so great at creating neurotransmitters because it's a full system that works at every layer of biology, right? That's compatible with every layer of life and biology and sustaining life. That means producing energy by eating and creating energy or protecting the system to prolong its lifespan and things. And because of that, it has a multi-layered, multi-therapeutic action on the system because it's a living system. Kava is a living system. The body's a living system. You interface the two systems that were shaped by the same natural intelligence or the ecology, and you get these different effects. But kava is mainly a protective substance, right? So that's why it hits on this GABA pathway. GABA protects us against stress hormones, protects us against excitotoxicity, calms the system down so that it can rest, right? Um, and these fat burning pathways are really the same thing. It's a
Yeah.
protective survival mechanism, right? It puts us into this state that is not only highly ketogenic, which is protective to the brain and the nervous system, but it protects the body from the overaccumulation of too much body fat, too many bad senescent cells that clog up the system and keep it from surviving or thriving over a long period of time, right? So it's a protective adaptive mechanism, right? The fat burning, just like the stress protection. And also its anti-seizure action happens through more just the GABA pathway. It's also a sodium and calcium channel blocker, which basically is the same mechanism that anti-seizure drugs, work on, which basically leads to a modulation or suppression of overexcitation of the cell, which can
Yeah.
happen through various different stresses, autoimmunity, can even happen through exposure to electromagnetic fields. You get
Yeah.
this high influx of calcium into the cell when you're exposed to certain types of EMF that creates DMA damage and just revs up the cell. Kava helps to diffuse that. So the reason why I say all that is that all of these mechanisms are protective. That's its main signature. And its second signature is what we touched on before, is as a mind and consciousness elevating substance. So it protects you from the things that are immediately threatening your survival as sort of like a higher vertebrate, as an animal. But then it also elevates your consciousness as well too. And the indigenous people believe that it protects you from those things so that it frees you up from the survival state of mind so that you can be elevated to a higher sense of spirit and purpose, right? Which is kind of cool in that regard. So the fat burning pathway is just sort of, it fits in this wheelhouse of protective mechanisms, but it's really powerful in that regard. So we've been using it. We've done a lot of stuff, a lot of promotion with Bulletproof and
I
in
had
that
some today.
community. Yeah,
TruKava.
and it's we found out that it's an amazing adjunct to like a bulletproof style coffee. So like our kava oil, we mix it with caffeine and MCT, and they potentiate each other. Caffeine and
That's
MCT
awesome.
both enhance the uptake of the kava lactones into the brain, because caffeine acts as sort of a vasodilator and as a delivery system, and the MCT also acts as like a lipid raft that helps pull the kava lactones into the brain and into the cell. So you get an
Wow.
acceleration of the effects, and it's really amazing. And also the anxiolytic effect helps take the edge off the jitteriness of the coffee if people have problems with that. So it creates this really very calm, activated, centered, focused, that's sort of a calm, just enhanced fat burning state, right? It's this calm, focused, centered fat burning state, which is like, that's like you and I's dream during the day. That's what we want to be
Yeah.
in,
Yeah.
for most of the time, right? Where we're not distracted by being hungry and having to eat all the time. We're just in this centered, state where our mind is clear. We have maximum creativity. We can access our greatest flow state. and just be the best version of ourselves, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a couple extra adjuncts as far as like what we're seeing like with Kava and especially like the fat burning stuff. So
So cool. Um, just real quick, I wanted to ask you. I have two boys, 7 and 3. Have you seen anything with Kava and children in terms of I'm just thinking of like ADD or any kind of thing. Have anybody got back to you and said, "Dude, we're seeing amazing results with something like that"?
it's funny that you say that because yes, actually, absolutely. That was one of the most not surprising to me, but surprising to the community.
Yeah.
Um, you know, secondary byproducts. Kava also affects. I mentioned this before. So from a brain chemistry perspective, we talk about the GABA system a lot, but Kava actually also substantially affects the dopamine system, the serotonin system to a lesser degree, the cholinergic system, the acetylcholine system, and various other systems as well too. But those are the main systems that it hits. Dopamine is probably the system that it hits that's almost just as powerful as the effects that it has on the GABA system. So it's got this great balance of sort of focus and mental clarity and sort of that mood elevation, but it does it without depleting it or being addictive, which is so unique for a dopaminergic medicine, right? Because most things that powerfully activate dopamine create that depletatory effect that leads to that feedback loop of needing more. But
Yeah.
kava is not that way. It actually helps to replete that system and actually helps to build GABA receptors and to rehabilitate those systems while you're using it, while having an acute therapeutic effect. But I say that just to explain what we're seeing with ADHD. So we have a network of a couple thousand functional medicine doctors, and so we get a lot of tremendous feedback
Hmm.
aside from what we see in the literature as far as mechanisms. Um, and what we started to notice very quickly is that a lot of our physicians were using it with their patients and their patients' children because there's this epidemic of attention deficit for a lot of reasons. And a lot of it is a metabolic, issue with the brain because of all the toxins and stress we're exposed to. Some of it is the deviation of the just the massive inundation of different stimulus that's pulling the attention and shaping the brain and wiring and programming it to not be able to focus on one thing because of there's attention grabbers everywhere in social
Yep.
media and there's just no, you're not in one place doing one thing ever. But anyways, usually a natural elevation in brain chemistry helps. um, and so we have, gosh, I mean, I don't even know how many you know hundreds of reports that we have now of individuals who have had tremendous success either using as an alternative to amphetamines, for ADHD, which most of these physicians are not using anyways, right?
Yeah, they're
Because they're
not
like
using
functional
them. Yeah.
medicine physicians. But some of them, a lot of their patients come to them from the allopathic world, and they end up at them, and they've been on these drugs, and they're trying to get their children off them, right?
Yeah.
So they either use them as an alternative or to wean them off of those things. And for me, I know that because I was on amphetamines before, and I've used kava. You use the right forms, and you get this dopaminergic effect, and it is amazing for focus because it does. It's this calm, it's this centered. It sort of allows you to sort of block out the noise and be focused and be in that perfect sort of mental alpha state, which is really what you want for optimal growth and development of your mind. And so, yeah, we've had amazing feedback. I mean, tons and tons of people that have successfully reported that they've been able to use it as a direct alternative or to get their children off of it, and just has worked wonders, which I can definitely see. Those reports are anecdotal. We hope to see more hard data in the future, but it definitely looks pretty good. And with Kava too, those over-the-counter Kava capsules will give you none of that because all of the dopaminergic effects are killed with solvent extraction. There's none of them.
Wow.
There's none of that. It only happens through these extraction methods, and which and that kind of leads me to, I can tell you a little bit about what we've done differently to kind of create correct that real quick.
Yeah.
So yeah, so with I knew that we had to bring Kava into the marketplace. In order to get it into the marketplace in the big way, we had to create cost-effective, scalable forms of Kava that were shelf-stable and palatable, which were the two things that were the biggest problems with it. The biggest problems with Kava in the marketplace, the reason why it hadn't already made it to the market, is because most people try to extract it with solvents, kills the effects. Okay, so you know why that didn't work. And the second really two reasons are because of the taste is so bad if you do use the traditional prep, and the amount of time prepping it, which is like most people are not going to do or give it enough of a chance. Not going to prepare that muddy water for their kids every morning. It's like, are you
Yeah,
kidding
no
me?
way.
Uh, it's just not going to happen. Not practical. So we had to develop extraction methods that kept the full matrix of active constituents intact, figure out ways of stabilizing it, and then putting it in palatable forms that are user friendly, for the mass marketplace, right? And then do it at a cost effective way to where we could actually get it integrated into the marketplace as well too. So we have multiple different products, some that are already available, some that we're working on, that we have sort of targeted towards the mass market for the more subtle forms that can be scaled more, and then the extreme like recreational alcohol alternative market in the medical space that are the more prominent forms that are like the all out very very potent effects of kava.
Hmm.
So what we've done is our base product is an oil. It's called Kavaplex, and it's a new
I've
form
seen it
of
right
it's a
here.
kava oil. It's the only one of them out there. Yeah. So basically, we had to develop a special pressing method that myself and a few of our engineers that we know from Germany helped us develop. That is basically a true cold press. It's not an expeller press. Like all of the pressing that's out there that's really not cold at all. That actually pulls oxygen down into oils as it's doing, which is why it oxidizes most seed oils, which is a problem.
Mm.
Our method elicits virtually zero oxidation to any of the oil material in there.
Wow.
And what we found is we're able to pull out the full kavalactone complex out of the plant, and keep it intact in a concentration that's versatile and tolerable for all ages and any time of the day. This took a lot of time to dial in, and it's shelf stable. Okay, so it's like traditional kava in its most subtle form, to where it's like super versatile. It's not overwhelming. It's not like full blown kava recreational kava bar experience, but it's a great tonic. It's the thing we put in the bulletproof coffee. It's perfect for that.
Yeah, it is. I
Um,
had a cup today. It was fantastic, and I gave my boys a couple of droppers, and they didn't mind it at all. They liked it.
yeah,
So
yeah, it's good, and it has kava has this mild like numbing effect on the mouth of people, and it lets people know that they're getting real kava. It kind of numbs the mouth. Well, most people get that anyways. It only lasts for like a couple minutes, but yeah, so
yeah, I didn't
it's
even
it's
notice
good
it.
in that way. And then our other products, we just developed traditional extraction methods for a shot and a drink form. Like think like a 5 hour energy type of shot, but just kava instead. We've got a baseline shot that's just more just kind of like the Kavaplex, and then in the next month we have a whole line of drinks and shots coming out that are like the full blown like your recreational effects of kava, works fully like as an alcohol alternative type of thing, that
I
are a
can't wait for
stabilized,
that.
it's a new stabilized form of traditional kava, very specific strains that are it's amazing stuff. I'm super excited about it. That's going to be the big product that we see integrating it in sort of as like the functional beverage that can be a commodity in the United States, at that form, and then you can have different forms for more recreational use and stuff, even above that. But so yeah, so that's basically like the landscape of what we've tried to do with the products and kind of how they're different. It's taken years of development. I was developing this project for about 8 years before we ever launched the company, developing relationships in the islands, securing the farms, making sure we had robust supply, all of our SOPs, our testing processes, getting to know the industry, working out problems with the regulatory agency since this is something new. And I
Hmm.
had this whole scaffold built out to try to introduce a brand new commodity into the sphere here. Um, and yeah, I mean it's taken a long time. It's been a lot of work, but it's a massive passion project, and I knew that it needed to be done correctly. So I needed to have all my I's dotted and T's crossed before we undertook a project on this scale, so we could get around any kind of regulatory blowback. We're working ahead on all of those things, that are potential problems anytime that you're releasing something new into the culture like that. Um, and then maintaining quality, right? Because since we're the first
Yeah.
out there, it's our responsibility to set the quality standard that everybody else has to fall behind whenever they do try to do it, because they will. And so there's a big responsibility there for something like this, and so you made a commitment that we're going to do it at the highest level to get this thing integrated as well into the culture as we possibly can.
I love that, brother. I really appreciate you, man. I just want to acknowledge you for your story and just your perseverance to just continue to go through what you did and to come out the other side. I mean, it's amazing. And now we as a society get this gift that not only are you continuing, you're giving, and it's beautiful. So thank you.
Oh, absolutely, man. Yeah, I love it. It's fun for me, which is always a great thing. If you are fortunate enough in life to have the circumstances to where or the opportunity to where you can step into a form of work that you can find purpose in it, and also make a living at the same time, and contribute in some way, then man, that's a serious code and that's a serious gift. So I don't take that for
Yeah,
granted.
yeah, agreed. You ready to jump into some lightning round questions?
Sure, yeah.
All right. If if the old you could see the new you, what would the new you say?
What would the new me say if the old me could see me?
Yeah. What would the new you say to that old self?
Oh, okay, yeah. So what advice or anything would I give?
Yeah.
Basically, I would say a couple things. I wouldn't want to say too much, because part of what I mean. It's like, because part of the lesson comes in the experience itself, and no matter what
Yeah.
I would say, it wouldn't do it any justice to the old me, because part of what shaped my perspective, and my outlook and my approach to life was not some sort of vague description of the experience, right? It's like trying to describe someone what the Sistine Chapel looks like. You can only go so far, but if you don't stand there and see that beautiful ceiling, then it's not the same thing. It's not this
Yeah.
life-changing event, or it's not this beautiful thing. You know what I mean? So it's like, I would say, just very generally, I would say the most important value, or the most important characteristic that you can develop and continue to cultivate, is persistence.
I love
you
it.
know persistence persistence and perspective, right? You have to have perspective, and then have the persistence to then capitalize and execute on that thing, right? But perspective is kind of like, if you can just keep pushing forward, right? um Persistence beats talent. There's talented people everywhere. Unrealized talent is as common as a loaf of bread. Persistence
Yeah.
beats genius, right?
Yeah.
There's tons and tons of people who are extraordinarily intelligent, but don't have the passion, the inspiration, the determination, the wherewithal to try things enough times to actually make something of that intelligence that they've either been gifted with, or developed. And again, there's a difference between knowledge and wisdom, so it may not even be a fully cultivated intelligence. Persistence is better than education. I mean, the world is
Mm.
full of educated foolish people, right? you know you know what I mean. It's like, you people who have knowledge, but not necessarily the experience and the persistence and the passion to cultivate, like, wisdom, right?
Yeah, I know. I think you
um
mentioned Bill Gates earlier, I believe. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. So that would be the main thing, is just stay the course. Is I would tell that person, I would say, no matter what, trust the process, stay the course, and just be as authentic and genuine and true to yourself as humanly possible, and that will connect you to your core in a way that allow you to cultivate the perspective, and then just push forward. And I would also say, fail early, fail hard, and fail big, but then learn from it, right? It's like,
Yeah.
I don't blame people for their failures. In fact, I encourage it, just as long as they learn from them, right? It's only a failure if you don't learn from it, right? It's only
Yeah.
truly a failure in the sense, right? The road to success is paved with bricks of failure. You have to fail. It's like that
Yeah.
old thing, like, the saying about Thomas Edison. I don't know if it's true or not, but we'll just go
Yeah.
with it. It's like, it took him, 1,000 tries to develop the early prototype for what became the filament induced light bulb, right?
Yeah.
And then someone says, "Well, man, you failed all this time." I said, "I didn't fail. I discovered 999 ways how
Yeah.
not to make a light bulb, but I only need to
Right.
find one way to make it work, right?" And those 999 times led me to the perspective, the understanding, the wherewithal, the know-how, that I finally did execute it, and it changed the world. And so what
Yeah.
I would say to an earlier version of me, or just an earlier version of anyone, or anyone who's, you know, in an egregious circumstance, or is of a young age or a certain age, that truly wants to be the best version of themselves, doesn't know how, is to not be afraid of failure, to just get in there and be full willing to be a fool or an amateur, because everybody's a fool and amateur when they first start something. Don't be afraid or too insecure or too prideful to be the person who knows the least of anybody in the room. In fact, that's good because it's gonna elevate you to those people's level. You're gonna get in there and you're gonna fail and you're gonna say, okay, I'll try it again. Just try it again.
Yeah.
Just get back up and try it again, right? And that's the thing. It's like that's basically that would be what I would say. You know,
I love it. Yeah. I love that, dude. What books do you is there any books that have impacted you a lot in your life that jumps out at you that
oh,
you'd
there's a
recommend
lot.
other
I
people
mean,
read?
from a from from a physiological health and perspective level of like looking at what actually health is and how to build it and how to interface with the natural ecology and to feed a person with constituents of the living environment, and just from a philosophical standpoint what makes sense on how to nourish yourself physically, I would say Weston A. Price's work, is very has been very influential. The book, nutrition and physical degeneration, that one was extremely beneficial. Reading some of the work of people like Rudolf Steiner, and Victor Schauberger as well. They're sort of all in this wheelhouse of individuals that just talked about nature as sort of a living integrated system, and understanding how to interface and nourish yourself on a fundamental level. Weston A. Price was big on the fundamental understanding of how to nourish oneself and what the building blocks of what the human body is actually made out of from
Yeah.
a reflection of the environment standpoint, where we get sort of our deep understanding of you know the right kind of fats being the building blocks of our cell membranes and being the building blocks of like our hormones, and it being extremely important, but to not denature those fats and all those kind of things, and to have that be sort of kind of the foundation, and um, just sort of a general, just even from a philosophical understanding of nutrition. For more of a psychological, emotional, perspective, or sort of a personal development perspective, I would go to a more recent, book, or a couple different books. Like one that really stands out for me is Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life,
Yeah.
or he's got a new one out too. It's like 12 More Rules. Um,
Yep.
and I love Jordan Peterson. I've said this on a couple different podcasts. I'm giving him so many shout outs. People are like, well, this guy really loves him. I do. It's not even just that I love his message, because it's a very serious, it's a very sincere message about taking responsibility for your life and your circumstances. And I think that that's in many cases that's what the world is missing on the more pathological side of nefarious circumstances that are going on, is this victimhood mentality that's proliferated, that's robbed us of our sense of power and our sense of personal responsibility.
Yeah.
His message is all about sort of getting out there and just doing it, developing
Yeah.
discipline and responsibility, and connecting yourself with just the general fundamental principles of not only facing your own darkness, facing your own demons, not acting like there's no weeds there, but finding the weeds and pulling them out, you know
Yeah.
and excavating that, not acting like you're better than you are, not trying to run towards pleasure and away from pain, but dealing with it, looking at the reality of the situation and dealing with it, and just probably even wired into that, the fundamental understanding that it's okay to even be afraid, right? It's perfectly fine. If you're not afraid, it worries me. I don't fully trust someone who's not afraid, who's trying to embark on any substantial circumstance in their life, because that tells me that you don't understand the magnitude of what's at stake, right? If you don't take life seriously to some degree, or with some intention. Remember, it's like, we talk about courage, which is kind of parallels like personal responsibility, right? Or just dealing
Hmm.
with your circumstances, or developing as a person. And we have to remember that the courage is not a lack of fear. You know, courage doesn't erase your fear. Courage is when you face your fear, right? There
Yeah.
is no courage without fear, right? Is a
Hmm.
squirrel
I love that.
courageous because it runs out in front of a car? No, it just has no clue,
Yeah.
and then, a lot of those themes that are sort of in that sort of like Jordan Peterson thing, which he gets a lot of his perspectives from Carl Jung, which is probably one of the best minds of the last few hundred years, in my opinion, fusing psychology with a deep, true sense of spirituality, and your pursuit of truth. I just really resonate with that work a lot, and a lot of it is really about dealing with your demons and integrating them and taking responsibility. And I think that's just so big.
So good, man. I love that. Um, 2020 was a crazy year for everybody, but many people like yourself and some of the most impactful people that I've been in contact with around the world, they have reframed 2020. And so I was wondering if you could reframe it for us. Can you finish this sentence? 2020 was the greatest gift because why?
Yeah, I mean that would actually probably tail on what we kind of just touched on with the Carl Jung sort of kind of like the Jungian philosophy. 2020 was the greatest gift because it was a tremendous opportunity to discover our greater potential and to expand our perception of reality, the world around us, the nature of our individual and collective circumstances, and our perception of the possible. There's, you know, there's a there's an old symbolic archetype that has come up consistently in storytelling since the beginning of time, that in more recent sort of years, decades, and even like the last century, as we've started to get into more modern forms of storytelling, like movies and stuff, themes that come up regularly. These archetypal structures, of people and themes. There's a reason why we resonate with those things and why certain movies and books and things become so popular. Not because of the fiction that's around them. It's like, yeah, some of that's cheap thrills and special effects, but even aside from that, um, we're drawn to them because we fundamentally connect with the overarching themes and motifs that are fundamentally human, because we a lot of in a lot of respects we live the design of stories and storytelling because we need
Oh
that as
yeah.
sort of a reality simulation to connect with the underpinning of who we are,
Yep.
and some of our deepest aspirations, where we can find the hero inside of us, say in the hero's journey, and get away from the victim and understand the darkness and the villain and all this kind of thing. But anyways, I say that to just kind of say, like, let's take a classic story, and actually Jordan Peterson uses this a lot, so I'll use it. Um, he uses Pinocchio, for example, right? There's a tremendous symbolism in the Pinocchio story, and that's one of his favorite sort of Disney movies that has a lot of these timeless character archetypes in it. So many hidden truths in that story from a lot of different standpoints, obviously. But one of the main ones is the idea of going to the deepest, darkest place in the belly of the beast to find the origin of who you are. In the movie, Pinocchio has to go down to the deepest, darkest place in the ocean, in the belly of the whale, to rescue his father, which is symbolic of the origin of who he really is, right? So that is an archetypal structure that's as old as storytelling itself. Meaning that in order to discover the full nature of who you are, it takes going, it's like the road to heaven, the stairway to heaven leads through hell first. That's a Jungian principle.
Yeah.
That, Jung actually believed in this idea of what he called the integration of the shadow, which means that you couldn't really be a good person until you understood your capacity for evil and you understood the nature of the darkness on where it could
Yeah.
go. Because not only does it let you know where the darkness is, and it gives you the opportunity to discover the alternative to that and the significance of the light and the truth that's in the light through the suffering that it puts on you, the pressure that it puts on you. But it also, I mean, yeah, it forces you into a state where you're either forced to cave under it and give into it, or you're forced to dig deeper and find out the true nature of who you really are, which is that light darkness. It digs into the idea of duality, right? The yin
Yeah.
yang, the Taoism, the light and the dark, the truth and illusion. But the light is the thing that's actually tangible. The darkness is just the absence of light. It's the deviation from the light, right? And so
Right.
by being immersed in darkness, it puts pressure on us, and the saying pressure makes diamonds. It pulls out the true nature of who you are as kind of a survival mechanism to rediscover that sense of, because it brings about so much suffering that it forces you to face fundamental truths. It
Yeah.
forces
Yeah.
you to sort of, like the analogy of like a human being as like the trunk of a tree, where you've got all this dead wood and you've got the real wood that's in the very center, and it takes burning off the dead wood to actually get back to the center, and that process of burning off the dead wood really freaking hurts, but it's the crucial process that you have to burn through the dead wood to get to the actual living wood that's in the center as well too. So any of these analogies or these character archetypes or things basically say something very similar, that it's only necessity in most cases that brings out the highest level of human adaptation that allows us to remember who we actually are. You can't understand truth, life, freedom, purpose without experiencing the opposite of. It's that duality. You can't understand. It's like freedom. Those truly deprived of it actually know what it is, right? Because it's the
Yeah,
contrast that allows you to understand what it really is. You see what I'm saying? So
totally.
anytime you have a tremendous challenge, as horrific as it seems, like there's some gnarly shit that's going on in this world right now. There's no question
Right.
about it.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of it, but you have to, the highest place that you can aim as an individual is to take that and to see it as an opportunity to become a better version of yourself, to discover a truer version of yourself that you can then cultivate and use to orient yourself to improve life around you for the people that you love and for the collective as itself, to just to improve the process of life around you. If there is ever a meaning to life, in my opinion, it is to orient yourself in a way through which life objectively measurably improves for you and the people around you. That's pro-life in the true sense, right? Of like actually being for life instead of chaos and entropy and disease, degeneration, delusion, chaos, all of those. But we need the chaos to teach us what the light is. So from my perspective there, that'd be my
Cameron George, drop the mic. That was so good. What a great way to end the show right there, man. Thank you so much. Last but not least, where can people find you?
Well, you can find us at, for TruKava, you can find us at gettruKava.com. That's get, T-R-U, not T-R-U-E, kava.com. Everything about our project with TruKava is on there. I'm in the midst of starting a separate platform that's not there yet, but you can look up, Cameron George Kava on Instagram to follow that, or you can look up at TruKava on Instagram as well too, TruKava on Facebook, any of those things. You find me there, you'll find everything else that we're doing. So yeah, with Kava and anything else related. So,
Cameron, thanks so much, man, for being on the show, brother.
dude, so much fun.